Would you publicly accuse someone of a crime when you had no independent witnesses to it? Well, you almost certainly wouldn't, especially if you had prior knowledge of someone else being to blame. But that's exactly what the BBC has been accused of doing to Israel in this dossier. And the author of this dossier? Well, it's a former member of the broadcaster's own Editorial Standards Committee. This is the latest set of troubling allegations to hit the BBC as part of a Telegraph investigation into claims the broadcaster's coverage has systemic problems over impartiality. So let's get into it. In April and June 2024, the BBC published two stories about the discovery of mass graves at Al-Nasser and Al-Shifa hospitals in Gaza. According to the internal BBC dossier, the articles strongly implied that Israeli forces had buried bodies at both sites prior to withdrawing from the area. The articles also mentioned alleged evidence of war crimes, including bodies found with their hands tied and gunshot wounds to their heads. But the BBC's own Editorial Standards Committee was told that this narrative was wrong. The memo says that the most likely explanation is that the mass graves were dug by Palestinians themselves and the people buried there had died or been killed prior to the arrival of the Israeli ground forces. So, the BBC made a mistake. Well, perhaps. But the committee argues that the broadcaster knew that Palestinians were burying their dead at these sites before the Israeli raids. Several months earlier, the BBC itself reported on Palestinians digging mass graves, and geolocation clearly places the two burial sites in roughly the same area. Now, whatever your personal views may be on the actions of Israel in Gaza, implying a country committed war crimes when there is evidence to the contrary has serious ramifications, not least because it could erode the credibility of genuine war crime claims at a later date. And that isn't all, the former committee member said. They also raised serious concerns about differences in the way stories were reported on the BBC News English website and on BBC Arabic. Examples included this report about a Yazidi woman who was rescued by Israel after a decade in ISIS captivity. She was first kidnapped at the age of 11 in Iraq, and then she was later moved to Gaza. She was then freed by Israel last year and reunited with her family. But the committee noted stark differences in the way the story was promoted across the two BBC websites, not least the BBC Arabic headline, with Hamas's rebuttal placed centre stage despite the story being verified by Israeli, Iraqi and US officials. In fact, nearly 600 words out of the 1,000 words of the BBC Arabic story were taken up by a Hamas statement challenging Israel's version of events, a statement which didn't appear on the English version at all. And there's more. The dossier also reveals that BBC Arabic and BBC Gaza Today repeatedly platformed three individuals with anti-Semitic and pro-Hamas views. First, Ahmed Kanan, who described a gunman who killed 4 civilians and an Israeli police officer as a hero. Next, Samar al-Zanan, who suggested Jews should be burned as Hitler did. And finally, Ahmed Alaga, who described Israelis as less than human and said Jews were devils. All three were described as journalists. In a public statement, the BBC said they were just eyewitnesses. But the dossier refutes this, saying most viewers would consider their hundreds of appearances to amount to the role of a journalist, one who is almost a part of the corporation's reporting team. And their list of concerns goes on and on. But there's one overriding theme that underlies all of them, and it can be best summarised in 2 short and damning quotes in the dossier. It reads, "It is hard to conclude anything other than that BBC Arabic's story treatment was designed to minimise Israeli suffering and paint Israel as the aggressor." And slightly later on, it says, "Claims against Israel seem to be raced to air or online without adequate checks, evidencing either carelessness or a desire always to believe the worst about Israel." So, whatever your thoughts may be on Israel's actions in Gaza, how can we expect anyone to develop an informed or nuanced opinion when the BBC is only presenting them with some of the facts? That is perhaps the most damning takeaway of all.